This is Quarter Notes, the quarter annual music recap show. In this section, I'm going to cover some projects that may not have made my top list, but are still definitely worth checking out. On this new solo project, Bright Future, Big Thief vocalist Adrienne Lenker delivers heartbreaking stories of love, loss, and grief. Her unique emotional vocals are backdropped by beautiful minimalist indie country instrumentation, which she brings refreshing modernity to with witty, emotionally potent songwriting. Standout tracks Sadness as a Gift and this album's rendition of Big Thief's single Vampire Empire captured my attention on first listen, and other tracks Already Lost and Cell Phone Says have grown on me over the past month. Unfortunately, I personally didn't find many of the other tracks super compelling and haven't had much of a desire to dig into them deeper. Slower paced music tends to be a bit more difficult for me to latch onto, and I didn't resonate enough personally with the lyricism to keep my focus throughout. But given the quality sound and heart-wrenching storytelling that is present on the tracks that I do like, I have to recommend this whole project for the people that see something deeper that I can't. Overall, this project is a down-to-earth, somber selection of stories surrounding old memories, past relationships, and a dash of cynicism towards the modern day. It's a must-listen for the Big Thief fans. Reading like a prolonged spoken-word poetry session, The Great Bailout by Moore Mother navigates some key history surrounding the enslavement of African people, especially in London, through colonialism and labor exploitation. The crushing, haunting instrumentals and confused, fearful lyricism give this album an existential tone, creating in the listener an appropriate feeling of disgust and discomfort. This project knows what questions to ask and what historical context to address in order to dive into some themes of wealth and inequality and the forced integration of Africans into Western society. It's a challenging listen, to be fair, but it conveys its message well and leaves thought-provoking questions in its wake. Gangbusters Melody Club by Caravan Palace isn't going to be a pick for everyone, especially because this style of updated crooner music tends to get a bad reputation. Many projects that attempt this kind of modernized flapper music fall into a deep pit of obscurity or disdain from the music-loving public, whether that be for valid reasons like cheap-sounding effects or corny vocal inflections, or invalid reasons like a common perception of this music being sort of theatercore or inherently uncool. I personally find much of this music appealing despite its reputation, but biases aside, I think this album is legitimately worth the time of the general listening public. Caravan have set themselves apart by honing in on vocal performances and aesthetic effects, only drawing away from the usual modern sound of the album with intentional additions from the 20s futurism playbook. Not every song hits, but add your favorites to a playlist or something. To me, Peacemaker by Vera Sola is a very underrated and under-reviewed album when considering its strong songwriting and mostly solo production work. The gothic country instrumentation is lush and natural, using mostly violin and acoustic guitar to create an authentic and respectable grassroots aesthetic. The individual songs here all have great narrative storytelling, which to me is the most important quality for a gothic country album to nail. I wouldn't necessarily say there's a unifying concept throughout the project, but the musical prowess of the album provides such a solid sense of cohesion that helps these songs fit together as a whole. Vocally, the performances have such swagger and confidence behind them, which only assists the listener when digging into the narrative concepts. The most stunning songs to me are the ones that are most truthful to their musical roots, diving into heartfelt narratives of longing and loss. Some tracks touch on general feelings of love coupled with doubt, like on I'm Lying and Desire Path, and other tracks dive into more modern day issues like Bad Idea and Get Wise. So as a whole, the album carries a great songwriting variety. Overall, I just barely didn't have enough to say about this album to warrant a top spot this month, but I still recommend it wholeheartedly to anyone who has an appreciation for country or Americana-inspired music, because the songwriting really is top-notch when it hits. People Who Aren't There Anymore by Future Islands is an album full of danceable, driving synth pop with insightful lyricism that reflects on changes through life and the people you find and leave throughout it. It has a very dynamic, unique vocalist who sometimes strains to match the energy of the instrumentals, but usually just complements them. It's filled with infectiously catchy choruses, so definitely check this one out if you're into synth-focused music. Moves in the Field by Kelly Moran may be my favorite instrumental album this quarter. In terms of production, it's incredibly well recorded and mixed, almost feeling like you're sitting on the keys of the piano. The complexity of the performances are instantly entrancing as this performer layers on more and more melodic lines into this dense, spacious environment. It's a project that shows that sometimes all you need is a singular strong piano to fill an entire room with sound. I don't listen to much solo piano music casually, but this reminds me a lot stylistically to works by Keith Jarrett or the more recent Christopher Nolan film soundtracks. There's also great use of occasional subtle glitchy effects, which alongside this being a self-produced project, shows there was intention to make this project as true to the original artist's intention as possible. It's hard to truly nail down what is captivating about the breathtaking moments on this project, so I would just recommend giving this one a listen. In my opinion, it would make great background music for a study session or midday walk. Everything Everything by Mountainhead is fun, accessible, catchy indie pop music with strong songwriting surrounding humanity's constant resource use and escalating industrial progress. I really enjoy the production throughout, blending chunky synth rock instrumentation with lots of fun background vocals and auxiliary percussion. I think the vocal performance could definitely be a bit more clear, but I can't say his inflection doesn't fit the vibe well. I've come back to a few standout tracks like The End of the Contender and Cold Reactor many times, but as a whole album, it just doesn't have enough staying power to punch into my top picks. Check this one out though, I think a lot of indie pop friendly people will really enjoy it. This new solo album from Alabama Shakes vocalist Brittany Howard is a musical treat. The combination of lush psychedelic R&B instrumentation and her rich, versatile vocal performances create an entrancing experience. The range of Brittany's vocals allow her to express a ton of emotion, especially when dipping into deeper registers like on lead single What Now. There's a solid sense of cohesion between these tracks, with most starting or ending by fading into or out of these ambient singing bowl tones, which help create this identity of peace and psychedelia alongside the album's cover. I do have to say though, this at times feels like a band-aid for the pacing and flow problems this album has, leaning on the more energetic singles and these forced transitions to prop up the more spacious experimental tracks here. The placement of these tracks just feels a little arbitrary, and I feel that makes the last leg of this album distinctly less energetic than the first. I still think it sets a great mood as a project with a lot of aesthetic cohesion, but it has a hard time keeping my attention throughout. It works well as some background music while you work, and the singles on here are absolutely worth checking out if the whole thing isn't up your alley. Sadness Sets Me Free by Guff Reese is an album that I enjoyed quite a bit on first listen, despite some glaring flaws I see with it now. Perhaps it's my love of 70s yacht rock and general classic rock sounds, but the way Gruff emulates the vocals of artists like Cat Stevens or Brian Wilson's of Beach Boys really captivated me. The instrumentals reminiscent of ELO were just kind of the cherry on top. Sometimes though, the vocals on this album are just pretty weak, either being in too low of a register or straining to maintain a higher one. However, I thought this still fit pretty well with the music, and I think the strong songwriting here outshines the issues for the most part. There weren't a ton of reasons for me to come back to this album, but it's still a pretty fun listen while it's on, and there are certainly a few standout tracks that made it onto my playlist, like Celestial Candy Floss and Cover Up to Cover Up. I really enjoyed Where's My Utopia by Yard Act. This sassy, upfront British punk music has really quirky production, featuring random instrumentation, random vocals and vocal effects, and random departures from typical song structure. The vocals remind me a lot of Damon Albarn of Blur and Gorillaz, but the denser lyrics put more emphasis on the spoken word nature of this person's speech. The musical aesthetic is really stimulating, which is really great on first listen, but makes it hard to wrap your head around when trying to pick apart the narrative. However, this is helped when things slow down for the track Blackpool Illumination, which tells a long-winded story through the lens of a therapy session of finding appreciation in life and the current moment. It doesn't take itself very seriously, but it sets a really chill vibe as the narrator takes us through a glimpse of their childhood. This album is not quite strong enough to fall into my top picks, but it still has a ton of merit, and I recommend it to anyone who likes early Gorillaz or punk music more broadly. Madra by New Dad has a really chill, underplayed vibe to it, sticking to straightforward indie rock songwriting, delicate vocals, and steady bass, paired with basic drum beats and usually a pedaled-out chugging guitar to create a washed-out, dreamlike aesthetic. It serves as a soft wallpaper for the somber, retrospective songwriting about uncomfortable relationships and their tragic end. As an entire project, it doesn't blow me away as a similar style from track to track gets a little stale, but in terms of the vibe and energy it's trying to create, it does a fine job and I enjoyed listening to it while I was on. If you want to check it out, I would give the first track a spin and go from there, as it sets the tone quite well. I imagine it would be a great listen on a late night car ride or some other vibe-centric occasion. Vision by Dead Poet Society has some serious bite both lyrically and musically, capturing a lot of raw post-punk energy and siphoning it into airtight alt-rock songwriting. This band pumps out explosive punk anthems with sticky chorus hooks and chugging hits from the drums, bass, and heavily distorted guitars. Suffering a fair bit from a lack of musical variety, this band performs what they know very well, and I enjoy the energy most of the album is going for while I'm listening to it. Unfortunately, the somewhat one-note instrumental delivery is paired with vocals that I have a hard time enjoying due to the vocalist's tendency to roll their O's like they're talking in cursive. It's a totally subjective thing, but it comes off a bit too juvenile and makes me have a hard time taking the punk aesthetic seriously. If you want some simple indie rock with the energy cranked up to 9, give this one a spin for sure. This album really grabbed my attention at the start of the year with its 3-disc, 3-act concept that splits the album into 3 sections: The Pilgrim, Their God, and The Kind of My Decrepit Mountain. Each act establishes itself, with slight variations in the songwriting and a shift in mood as you progress through the album. Unfortunately, I find it difficult to follow the narrative through to its conclusion, really only grasping the story elements on the first act, and the spoken word intros of each act don't aid in my understanding. On the surface, they do a great job emulating the 3-act structure, but it feels like the actual narrative beats are lost in translation somehow. somehow. Despite this, I've spent a lot of time from some of the individual tracks on this album this quarter, including My God, Untitled, Eidolon, and most of the songs from the first act. When the band finds their footing, they're able to evoke such vivid imagery through their symbol-heavy songwriting and dense instrumental palette. There are often layered passages from softer woodwind instruments that add a lot when revisiting this album because there are so many details to latch onto. Considering how appealing much of the auxiliary percussion scattered into the mix is, I found some of the main drum machine loops to be disappointingly cheap sounding and simplistic, especially when they open many of the tracks. However, once the better performances are layered on and the vocal melodies take the limelight, it's not very noticeable. Definitely check this one out if you've been enjoying this trend of chamber pop indie bands like Black Country New Roads. This band has a really unique spin on that sound and show a ton of promise moving forward. This album was one of the first big releases of 2024, getting a lot of acclaim when it first dropped before kind of falling off after its first week. The critical analysis of this album seemed to be that it leaned too heavily on aesthetics popularized by Radiohead, but I really don't find that fair as the band does a great job of creating original songs and carving out their own sound. Yes, there are moments where the performances are reminiscent of Thom Yorke, especially in the opening moments of the track The Killer, but the instrumentals for the majority of the album are much more grounded in math rock or even prog metal stylings. Ultimately, unless if it is blatantly ripping melodies and instrumental tones, I find it hard to criticize music for wearing its influences on its sleeve. If you like Radiohead or just enjoy dynamic progressive indie rock in general, check this one out and decide for yourself if it stands on its own. She Reaches Out to She Reaches Out to She by Chelsea Wolfe is an album that's been getting a lot of critical acclaim recently, and although I can't say I dislike it, I feel like my limited history with this type of gothic industrial ambient music is stopping me from fully respecting what it has to offer. It does sound absolutely fantastic, and I can respect the sonic world Chelsea is creating here, but personally, I feel underwhelmed by most of the vocal performances, and I don't like much of the mix for this project. I don't want to dig too deep into negatives because there really is a ton I love about the sound of this album, and I just haven't dug deep enough into the lyrics to speak on them. But it just didn't successfully strike a chord with me on any deeper level throughout the listens I gave it. If you like this album, let me know what I missed because I can see that there are some amazing qualities here that I just need to view from the right perspective. Fairweather Friend by The Umbrellas is a fairly enjoyable experience. The short and to the point songwriting captures feelings of looking back on a relationship with a mature perspective and letting go of your memories of someone. The jangle pop, Smiths-like sound of the project is enjoyable throughout if you're into that sort of thing, and I think the female vocalist on this project has a lot of synergy with that sound. Unfortunately, this album is hard for me to come back to as much as I would like because the male vocalist here just really does not suit my fancy. He always sounds like he's like a half a pitch out of tune or something. There are a lot of tracks that I absolutely love on this album, like Goodbye and Echoes, but they only made their way onto my playlist due to a lack of this guy's vocals. Anyways, if you're into the jangle rock stuff, give this one a shot and maybe the vocals won't bug you as much. Harm's Way by Ducks Ltd is another jangle rock album, this time with a bit more oomph instrumentally and more structured songwriting overall. Unfortunately, for me, the sound is a bit too similar throughout to not get fatigued with by the end. I have to acknowledge though that this could just be that I'm not into jangle rock as much as other people, so if you're a big fan of the Smiths, this might be up your alley. The vocal performances are really great throughout, striking a solid balance between whine and tone, and I appreciate the closing track Heavy Bag for stripping things back to just guitar and letting the vocals really shine. It's an understated album for sure, but I can see someone with a love for softer rock and well-sung poetic songwriting claiming this album as a gem for the quarter. Everybody Can't Go by Benny the Butcher is probably my favorite rap album this quarter in terms of the quality of its beats and features. The dual production work from Hit Boy and The Alchemist works well together flow-wise for this album, switching it up between Hit Boy's warm West Coast boom bap production and The Alchemist's more cold and precise sample work full of these dizzying reversed orchestral samples and channel effects. Like I said, the album is filled top to bottom with interesting features, my favorite being Lil Wayne on Big Dog, Armani Caesar on Buffalo Kitchen Club, and Stove God Cooks on One Foot In. Benny gives a solid performance throughout, really keeping pace and complimenting everybody he's bringing onto the project. There weren't a ton of incredible standalone verses on the album, unfortunately, with a lot of the songs sort of blurring together for me, aside from the ones complemented by the aforementioned plentiful feature list. I can't say it's really boring or one note, but it didn't really leave a lasting impression on me after I moved on from it. It definitely has a strong identity though, and I enjoyed the production a fair bit, so give this one a try if West Coast rap does it for you. Bite Down by Rosalie is a pretty refreshing listen amongst the hordes of indie rock singer-songwriter projects that have come out this quarter. Musically, it isn't the flashiest, most technically impressive of its genre, but I think Rosalie does a great job of taking ideas from classic folk, country, and Americana and pushing them into a modern age with vibrant production work and solid songwriting. She adds a lot of psychedelic elements to this record, with these crisp, burnout guitar solos in the more active songs and these warbly ambient effects in the less active ones, which draw me in quite a bit. Unfortunately, this album didn't end up clicking with me enough to listen to it more than a couple times, so I don't have a ton of other thoughts about it. It's clean, it's vibrant, and it's just unique enough to warrant a shout out, but I guess it didn't really stick with me after I finished it. Check this one out if you're into indie folk girlies, because there are certainly some standout musical moments here that deserve appreciation, but in my opinion, much of the project just isn't pushing the envelope or going as far as it could. What Happened to the Beach by Declan McKenna is a solid indie pop album, juggling its soft ukulele boy songwriting with wacky experimental production elements. The closest comparison I can make vibes-wise to this album is still Woozy, with the understated soprano vocals and chill washed-out musical aesthetic. However, the sound here feels much more rooted in traditional folk influences. My favorite track here is I Write the News, which starts with this Nick Drake-style guitar strumming, but then wraps it in deep, bouncing bass and layers of electronic trickery. I don't love the whole project through and through, but I know the indie pop heads out there are going crazy over this one. It's unique, it's dynamic, and to sum it up best, there is more to it than I know how to sum up. So just check it out. How to Make a Masterpiece by Masterpiece has a fantastic sound at its core, competently mixing a variety of influences within both punk and pop music. The brash inflection through most of the vocal performance really helps to emphasize the punk energy especially. I think the overall vision for this project sort of falls off the rails midway through though, throwing a lot of different aesthetics at the wall to see what sticks. It makes it hard to consider it the masterpiece the artist claims it to be, but I still see a ton of talent and potential in this album. It's loud and in your face and doesn't try to water itself down by any means. I think there was just a lot of ideas this artist had, and I think some of those ideas just needed a little bit more polishing before publishing. Audio Vertigo by Elbow has sufficiently filled my need for flashy yet raw garage rock this quarter. The production work here is stellar, really encapsulating the listener in this environment of thudding bass, clock-like drum work, a variety of warbly guitar sounds, and soft sensual vocals. Tracks like Baloo also wrap the sound in vibrant synths and auxiliary percussion. It also feels like this band is trying to wear clear influences on their sleeves, constantly hitting my ears with sounds that remind me of different acts. It leaves me wondering how much of this is an intentional part of the Audio Vertigo concept they're going for, and how much is simply an inability to twist these sounds into their own thing. Regardless, there are some really awesome musical moments if you're a fan of busy psychedelic garage rock. Whereas Benny the Butcher brought the features, Schoolboy Q brought lyrical genius to this new album Blue Lips. What I think is especially impressive about Q's songwriting is his ability to switch between tracks that are so hard and raw and tracks that serve as deep meditations on gang violence, hip-hop culture, government control, and a variety of other socially conscious topics. The production work is versatile on this album, featuring many different producers with many different styles, but the track list balances these different sounds well and creates a fantastic flow. Speaking of flow, I have a hard time getting bored with the cadences Q switches between here. Like a lot of rap projects, I do feel like there's a fair amount of bloat here, with my attention trailing off more and more throughout, but I do think the ending does a good job of bringing the project home. Overall, it's worth checking it out if you like conscious rap. 9 by Kenny Mason does a great job of taking in a lot of new influences in the world of rap and curating a collection of bangers most new head rap fans will be into. Like its contemporaries, this album's main sound is simplistic trap beats and banging hits of synthetic bass. Other sounds do a good job of filling out the mix and creating a chill environment, and I really like the sound of the track Slip featuring Toro y Moi, but at its core, this album isn't trying to innovate on the basic trap stylings it's emulating. It's not really an album that deserves a ton of technical scrutiny though, serving much better as a collection of bangers to rep at work or in the car. It's fun, it's carefree, and it's perhaps the definition of music that won't scare the hoes. These two albums, Everchance by Cluster and The Collective by Kim Gordon, are two albums that came highly recommended on a lot of music review outlets this quarter. And as much as I have enjoyed my experience with both, I find it difficult to find the right words to correctly explain why they're worth your time. Maybe I just need more experience with this type of album with dense, hyper, distracted production work. I do need to clarify that I don't like these albums equally, with the Kim Gordon album being much more impressive in terms of vocal delivery and mixing, but they do both have a quality about them that I love as much as I can't describe, as well as a quality I dislike enough to not return to the project to dig deeper. I know I'm being vague here, so check out these albums for yourself and maybe you'll see what I'm getting at. The production work and general aesthetics of both projects are really solid, but suffice to say their reach might be a bit niche. Rat Taxi by Louis Zong is not an album to take too seriously, describing itself as the soundtrack for a cabbie rat as he drives around the city. Instrumentally, this album is composed mostly of bright, in-your-face arrangements of punchy drum and bass loops, clear brass and woodwind samples, and usually a leading guitar, MIDI, or 8-beat melody, creating a fun, carefree, and danceable vibe that does sort of make you feel like a grubby little street rat. It diverged from this on the second track, Cheesy Street, which features a verse from Dante NK where he spits like 30 cheese puns in the course of 2 minutes. It's stupid and it doesn't take itself very seriously, like I said, but that kind of music is always going to grab my attention, and there just happens to be really interesting and engaging sample work throughout this project. It might not blow you away if this kind of music isn't your style, but I am personally really glad YouTube recommended this one to me because I think it's a gem. Listen to this one if you're cheesy like me. Two Star in the Dream Police by McGee sits closely in my mind stylistically to Scrapyard by Quedeca, which I talk about in my top of the queue as being great at playing into its strengths and weaknesses by using really creative homespun production. However, this album has a different set of strengths and weaknesses that set it apart from Scrapyard, neither for better or worse really. Here, the sound is much more uniform and the mixing is less experimental, but the post-processing on everything is really unique, making everything pop while still feeling like it's sort of melting together or morphing somehow. There's also just really great song crafting on the album, to the point where I'm as invested in the sound of the verses as the sound of the choruses. Unfortunately, I think there are too many moments where this album leans a little too heavily on its 80s influences, which sort of take me out of the psychedelic elements and has me viewing this project as a bit too glitzy and airbrushed conceptually. Ultimately, it's a really great project to listen to during a late night vibe if you're into 80s outfits like The Police or Cyndi Lauper, so give it a shot if that's your thing. 2093 by Yeat has been an album that's been up for much debate regarding its relevance in hip-hop, and I have to say I think it's just good. It isn't doing anything super innovative or extraordinary, but I think Yeat found an instrumental aesthetic that really works for him here, with this dark, industrial, cyberpunk 2077-like backdrop. It reminds me a bit of Lil Yachty's last album and how he quote-unquote redefined himself and received a ton of critical acclaim, but at the end of the day, these two artists just created a decent album in a sound that better fits them. It's good, I liked it, I just don't think it's as revolutionary as people are making it out to be. I really liked Invincible Shield by Judas Priest, mostly because it's super impressive for these guys to be kicking this much ass after 50 years have passed since their initial release. Is the whole hair metal thing sort of a dated genre? Yeah, maybe, but do these guys deliver some of the best music to come out of that genre for a long time? Yes, absolutely in my opinion. The performances are fiery and heart-pounding, the production is airtight, and the songwriting is catchy as hell. If you like classic metal music, this album is as close as you're going to get to a faithful emulation of that sound, and impressively, it's from a band that was one of the founders of it. Despite some aspects like the mixing still having quite a bit of room to improve, Shoelace and a Knot by Young Gatita shows off a ton of fun ideas through its laid-back indie psych pop aesthetics. The lead singer has a voice that strikes a strong balance between soft and angsty, the chord hooks on many of these tracks are biting and catchy, and there's a lot of interesting variation in the groove-driving instrumentals. Nothing to really blow you away conceptually, but definitely check this one out if you need a healthy dose of sedated angst. The next album of note is These Nuts by Ninja Sex Party. Yes, these guys are probably much too old now to be joking about banging their karate teachers' moms and magical boners this much, but given their band name is Ninja Sex Party, I can look past that as just an essential part of their branding, and when I judge this album just on its merit, I think it shows a great progression of comedy songwriting from the band. The instrumentals are varied and fairly locked in, if not a little simplistic, and the vocals are pretty great throughout. Obviously, much of the punch of this album lies in the songwriting and execution of jokes, so with humor being subjective and all, it's entirely likely this album doesn't work for you, but to me, it's inoffensive and it's fun. Diamond Jubilee by Cindy Lee is a crazy ambitious project for something that was just posted on YouTube. Several hours of intentional and entrancing psychedelic rock harkening back to the sound palettes of the late 60s and early 70s lay the groundwork for this album. I haven't had the pleasure of checking out the whole thing in depth yet, but from my time with it, it lacks some polish, but it's a nice listen nonetheless. If you're into the 60s, 70s rock aesthetic, definitely check this one out. It's fun, it's vibey, it's worth it. This EP, Still Life by Twikipedia, shows off really great songwriting with a shift towards softer sounds compared to their regular output. It's sort of an unpolished, lo-fi bedroom sound, but if you're into that kind of stuff, there's a ton under the hood to dig into here. Silly But Silky by Silly Silky is perhaps my favorite Korean pop adjacent project of the quarter. There's tons of fun production and memorable hooks that make a full album listen decently enjoyable, although I probably wouldn't find myself coming back to these tracks individually very often. Progressive metal band Witness Marks came out of the gate swinging with this debut EP, To Climb, showing a lot of promise in their songwriting talent, instrumental performances, and general band presentation. The drumming is especially dynamic, standing out as something that sets this band apart from some of the more generic groups in the genre. Burning Down the House by Paramore is just a single, but I want to shout it out because holy cow, this is such a fantastic cover. Like most people are saying, Hayley Williams absolutely pops off with her vocal performance here, but I just want to express how much I love the instrumentals too, really freshening up the song for the 2020s with such tight performances. I want to shout out a couple of deluxe albums that came out this quarter that I thought were fairly good additions to their base albums, those being Desire I Want to Turn Into You by Caroline Polachek and Guts by Olivia Rodrigo. I can't say all of the new tracks necessarily stuck with me after listening to them, but just bringing me back to listen to these base albums again made me appreciate both of them even more, and I recommend checking these deluxe projects out whether you've experienced the base albums or not. So there you go. That's just shy of 40 albums that I listened to this quarter that didn't quite make my top list, but still deserve your attention nonetheless. Did I not talk about your favorite album in this video or my top of the queue? Let me know in the comments. In the final 2 videos for this quarter, I'm going to be talking about my least favorite albums, as well as recapping all the drama I can remember. If you want to see that, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching this far, and I hope to see you soon for some more quarter notes.